Section 6. If they persist still to say that the alleged texts are in themselves a solid foundation for my faith, although such an aspersion is contrary to their universal profession and overturns the whole fabric of popery, yet because I know those Proteiuses will turn themselves into all shapes, and endeavor to slip all knots, and because I observe all their writings are stuffed with several texts of Scripture, as if they would make their deluded proselytes believe they made them the foundation of their faith, I shall therefore make some brief remarks upon the chief of their Scripture allegations in pursuance of the proposition under consideration, and show that the faith of a papist hath no foundation at all in the sacred Scripture, in the great and fundamental point of the Pope's infallibility. Only that you may understand the dissidence which some of their own great rabbis have in their Scripture arguments, I shall mind you of a remarkable saying of eminent Dr. Pigvius, who, persuading his Catholics in their disputations rather to argue from the tradition than Scriptures, he breathes out into these memorable expressions: of which doctrine, if we had been mindful that heretics are not to be convinced out of Scriptures, our affairs had been in a better posture, but whilst for ostentation of wit and learning men disputed with Luther from Scripture, this fire, which, alas, we now see, was kindled. As if he had said, you may as soon fetch water out of a stone as prove the Romish cause from the Scripture. Oh, the power of truth! How the desperateness of the popish cause! His counsel indeed was good, but they could not follow it. For having once been fumbling about some Scriptures, though they saw well enough how impertinent they were to their purpose, yet having once begun, they were obliged to proceed and make good their attempts. For of all things in the world they hate retreating and recanting. Lest they should put an argument into our hands against the infallibility of the Church from her actual mistakes and errors in the exposition of Scriptures. Section 7. The principal places of Scripture upon which the Pope's supreme authority and infallibility is founded are as follow. The first is Matthew 16, verse 18. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Ergo, the Pope is supreme head and infallible. I shall forbear actum agere, and therefore shall omit several answers already given, and only point at some few of those many allegations by which the ridiculousness of this collection may appear, and the desperateness of that cause that can find no better supports. First, this promise concerns only the invisible church of elect persons, which appears thus, because he speaks of that church against which the gates of hell do not prevail. But the gates of hell do prevail against all reprobates. And therefore the meanest sincere elect Christian in the world hath a juster claim to infallibility from this place than many popes of Rome had, whom their own authors confess to have been reprobates. Secondly, this promise secures the Church as well from damnable sins as damnable errors. I prove it. The Church is here secured against the prevalency of the gates of hell. But the gates of hell may prevail as surely, and do prevail as frequently by damnable sins as by errors. Ergo, if therefore, notwithstanding this text, popes have fallen into damnable sins, they may consequently fall into damnable heresies. Thirdly, the infallibility here promised extends only to damnable heresies, and such as lead to, and leave a man under the gates of hell. And therefore, if it were intended of the Pope and Church of Rome, Christ promiseth no more infallibility to him than he hereby promiseth and generally giveth to all persevering Christians. Fourthly, this promise is spoken of and made to the whole Church, and therefore belongs to all the parts and members of it alike, so that, if it prove the infallibility of the Romish bishop and church, it proves also the same of the bishops and churches of Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, etc., which may further appear thus: that if we should grant the papists their absurd supposition that this work was not Peter's confession, but his person, yet since the bishops of Corinth and Ephesus, and indeed all the bishops of the world, according to this supposition, were built upon Peter's person, as well as the bishop of Rome, and the infallibility supposed is here promised equally to all that are built upon the rock, it must either prove all of them infallible, or leave the Pope fallible. Fifthly, whatsoever authority or infallibility is here promised to Peter is in other places promised and given to the rest of the apostles, and therefore what is collected from this place for St. Peter's successors may be with equal truth and evidence pleaded from other places, from the successors of the rest of the apostles. The same keys which are here promised to Peter are actually given to all the apostles, Matthew 18, verse 18, and John 20, verses 22 and 23. And if infallibility be here promised to Peter, as much as is promised to all the apostles, John 16, verse 13, he will guide you into all truth. And if St. Peter be here called a rock, so are the other apostles called pillars, Galatians 2, verse 9, and foundations, Ephesians 2, and that 16th of Matthew, speaking not one syllable more of transmitting St. Peter's authority to his successors than those other places do to their successors. And therefore, it unavoidably follows either that all their successors are infallible, or that St. Peter's successor is fallible, at best, for anything that appears from this text. Whether the Pope's infallibility hath other foundations, we shall examine in their order. Sixth, it may be said that although this place may not seem to be cogent to one that considers it in itself, yet if you take it according to the exposition of the Fathers, it proves what is alleged. Number one, the Fathers generally did understand this rock to be not Peter's person, but his confession, or Christ as confessed by him. And this you shall find proved to have been the mind of St. Cyril, Hilary, Hiram, Ambrose, Basil, Augustine, yea, and the whole council of Chalcedon, in that uncomparably learned and irrefragable discourse of Mullins, called the Novelty of Popery. Secondly, or number two, that the Fathers are not infallible guides the faith and religion I shall prove in the next proposition. Number three, but howsoever they that assert the infallibility of the Fathers, when they relate the Church's judgment, yet allow their fallibility in expounding Scripture. Cajetan and Maldonate both acknowledge it, and practice accordingly, that a man may in many cases prefer a new exposition, though it be repugnant to the expositions of most of the ancient Fathers. And Sir Kenelme Digby, speaking of the infallibility of the Fathers, expressly saith, he understands it only of the traditions or doctrines delivered by them as the faith received from their ancestors, not of their comments or sermons upon Scripture, which are to have no more weight than the reasons they give for them. That from the letters between Lord Digby and Sir Kenelme Digby, page 10. But if all these and other difficulties were cleared, yet do two things remain behind, in which this text and all others are wholly silent. For them, they are forced to fly to tradition and the authority of the Fathers, of which in the next place. The first, that all this supreme authority and infallibility which they suppose to have been in Peter was transmitted to his successor, and consequently Linus, St. Peter's successor, was superior to the apostle, and evangelist St. John, which he had need have no squeamish conscience that can digest. And yet all this amounts to nothing unless another thing be proved, that is, that the Bishop of Rome is St. Peter's successor. And here the Scriptures fail them. And the coronus or apex of the argument, without which it is both impertinent and impotent, as to the probation of the sovereignty of the Roman bishop, is fetched solely from tradition and the testimony of the Fathers. And so their arguments stand like the angel in the Apocalypse, with one foot on the earth, another on the sea, one leg of it in Scripture, the other in history, and because conclusio sequitur partem deteriorem, the conclusion cannot be defied, or rather, to speak the truth. The whole syllogism is extra-scriptural. The prerogatives of St. Peter are transmitted to St. Peter's successors, but the Bishop of Rome is St. Peter's successor. Where it appears from what hath been said that neither proposition is to be proved from Scripture, but wholly from tradition, and that is all at present I am concerned to make good. And yet if all this were over, they have not done. Behold the misery of a desperate cause. For whereas it is known and granted by the Papists that St. Peter had 2 sees, he was bishop of Antioch for 7 years, saith Baronius, and bishop of Rome, it must be further evinced that the bishop of Antioch was excluded from, and the bishop of Rome invested with, St. Peter's prerogatives. And would you know the proof of this position, which is the very foundation stone of the Pope's supremacy? You shall have the argument in Bellarmine's words. It had its rise e facto Petri from St. Peter's fact. Peter leaves Antioch and comes to Rome, and there he dies. And so his holiness got the day.